Hi, DFO members. Welcome to DFO's very first webinar, another proud moment in DFO's history. I'm Dave Hill, President, and I'm accompanied by Peter Stoltz, Secretary, who's taking care of technical matters, and members of the Conservation Committee, who have brought us tonight's program. Members include Susan Blancett, Roger Kester, Colleen Nunn, Ian Redfield, and Steve Ryder. We're thrilled to have you all present tonight and hopeful that you're comfortably settled in front of your computer screen with functional audio and video channels. Please take a moment at this time to familiarize yourself with your screen surroundings. Locate the chat icon on your screen. At any time during tonight's webinar, you can select or click on that chat icon. You will then be able to enter a question. All questions will be delivered to Steve Ryder. He will address your questions to our speaker at the end of his presentation. At this time, I'd like for Steve to introduce tonight's speaker. Steve?
Thanks, Dave. Welcome everyone to our presentation. I'm Steve Ryder. I'm a member of the Conservation Committee. We're very pleased to present this talk about a really important bird conservation topic this evening. Just a reminder, before we begin, let's see. We'll be keeping track of questions that are asked via, and we might like to have you use the Q&A button. If you'd like, you can use either one, the chat button or the Q&A. I'll monitor both. And we'll have Alex address any questions you may have about the presentation at the end. So I would like to begin things by introducing this evening's speaker, Alex Halverson. I have a short bio here. Alex is a cross-discipline graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder, working towards a master's degree in environmental studies and a master's of business administration. It has always been his goal to work in the conservation world, but learned early in his career that the management side of these organizations was more suited to his abilities than were long hours of field research and data analysis. He left a coinciding pull, or he has felt a coinciding pull from government agencies, especially at the local and state levels. As well as being a graduate student, Alex has been interning for the City Naturalist Office within Denver Parks and Recreation since May of 2019. His greatest responsibility in that role has been launching, managing, and administering Lights Out Denver, the city and county of Denver's audacious attempt to make Denver more bird-friendly. Besides birds, he has worked with elephants in Tanzania, hawksbill sea turtles in the Caribbean, and like all good wildlife biologists do, has worked for Coors Brewery in Golden. Welcome, Alex.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that intro. So I'm equally honored to be the first guest to do one of these online presentations, online lectures. I've taught online, I've taken class online, I've had meetings online, but I've never given a lecture in front of an empty audience, so to speak, an invisible audience. So this will be interesting. There'll be times I'm definitely thinking that I'm talking to myself. So I just have to remind myself that I'm not. So let me start off by sharing my screen. So feel free to type in the chat if there's any sort of technical glitch going on. That's bound to happen from time to time. And hold on, share the wrong screen. There we go. Oh, and we're off to an auspicious start. Let me get the other PowerPoint ready. What's going on here? All right, one moment. There's some sort of technical difficulty on my end. It's not pulling up the proper PowerPoint. Bear with me for a second, please. I'll get that fixed for you, everybody. There we go. I think it should be good now. I promise it's not my first time. We'll be good. All right. So the title of my presentation is Lights Out Denver, Roots and Future. It's focused largely on Lights Out Denver, hence the title and hence the introduction of Lights Out Denver. This program is run by Denver Parks and Recreation, along with a team of dedicated volunteers, and there's one of them, one of which I see is watching this, and it's also run with collaborating organizations and partners. There will be 4 general topics that I'll be talking about today throughout the presentation. I'll be starting the presentation by giving a brief overview of anthropogenic bird mortality in the United States. It's a mouthful to say. Another way of saying that is human-imposed mortality on birds, especially as it pertains here in the US. That topic alone can't be covered in one presentation, but I'll do my best to provide as much of a thorough overview to help orient ourselves and to help everyone understand why projects like Lights Out Denver are in existence in the first place and what we aim to do. I'm guessing that anthropogenic bird mortality is a topic that many of us in the audience are knowledgeable about. We're all in the birding community. This is a huge aspect of bird conservation. But I still hope that I can provide at least one tidbit of knowledge that you didn't have before. You can walk away knowing something that you didn't know coming in. I'll then go into detail about Lights Out Denver, its background, some of the data we've collected over the first 2 seasons, and then the next steps and where we hope to take the project. And then time permitting, I'll be moving on to ways that we can make our buildings, our offices, and our homes, our residences more bird friendly. Some of those I'm guessing we know at least some of them as well. And then we'll be going into some of the current bird friendly legislation that's going on all 3 levels of government. All right. So when we think of human-caused bird deaths, I'll guess that many people, us included, us as in the birding community and those in attendance tonight, think first of cats and collisions with buildings. I'm going to refrain from going down the cat route. I know that they seem to be pretty divisive in the birding community, and we all have our own opinions of cats, but I'll largely stay away from that. I'll just be presenting data on cats. So when we think of bird deaths caused by humans, we're not wrong in assuming that cats and collisions with buildings are the 2 predominant sources of it. But unfortunately, those 2 aren't the only anthropogenic threats to birds. This table here lists a handful of the most common hazards, most common sources of bird mortality here in the United States. And the numbers might differ, but the sources won't if you go from one country to the next. If you go from the US to Canada, to Mexico, to Nigeria, to England, to name the country, these sources are going to be the most predominant ones. The top line in the table, collisions with building glass, is the scope with which we work here at Lights Out Denver. Lights Out Denver aims to reduce bird collisions with buildings. We would love to reduce all sources of anthropogenic mortality. That would be wonderful. I think everybody would be on board with that. But the enormity of that task and the legal regulations can prevent us from doing that, or prevent any management agency from doing that. And some we might not ever be able to tackle at all. So after glancing through this table, you'll start to realize just the enormity of this issue, just how deadly our cities and our structures are to birds. They're just not friendly to birds at all. Each year in the United States alone, over 3 billion birds perish because of human-induced activities or structures. And granted, these are estimates. So these numbers in this table are all estimates, but these are median estimates. There's estimates that place the number a little bit higher, and there's numbers that estimate this at a little bit lower. All right. So like I said, the top line is what we'll largely be focusing on throughout the rest of the presentation. However, there are two hazards that haven't been included on this list, those being habitat loss and artificial nighttime lighting. Both of those undoubtedly kill birds, and we see habitat loss pretty much anywhere we go. And they kill birds directly and indirectly. And my assumption is that bird mortality via habitat loss is extremely hard to quantify. You can't go out and measure that bird died because of habitat loss, that bird died because of habitat loss. It's something that's kind of inherent in a lot of these other sources of mortality. For example, buildings. With urban sprawl, buildings pop up, birds collide with buildings. Indirectly, you can contribute that to habitat loss. Birds also confuse nighttime lighting with celestial cues. A lot of birds are celestial navigators. They're guided by nighttime skies. And the most common and notorious example that I can think of, at least, of nighttime lighting being a threat to birds is the 9/11 memorial in New York City. I don't think there's anyone amongst us who would argue that we should not have this memorial. It's a wonderful way to memorialize what happened. But on every September 11th in New York City, these two very bright beams of light shoot up from where the two towers used to stand, or the Twin Towers stood. And unfortunately, about 160,000 birds every year get entangled, get entrapped in these lights. And they'll just be circling these lights because we believe that they're just kind of confused, and substitute that light with celestial cues. And if you look at the image on the left, you'll see individual specks. Each one of those is a bird. It's not dust, it's not leaves falling, they're birds. Fortunately, though, New York City's Audubon Society works closely with the groundskeepers of this memorial. And once they notice that there's a lot of birds entrapped in the light, the groundskeepers will turn off the lights to allow the birds to reorient themselves. So there are ways that we can work together, both conservation organizations and birding community work with the non-birding community to make our cities more bird friendly. And so you're I've talked about the last two slides about just the threats to birds that we kind of impose on them. Now I want to go more in depth with windows and buildings, because again, that's where Lights Out Denver focuses on. Moral of the story, if there's only one takeaway you take from this presentation, it's that windows and birds just don't get along. They're never going to be friends, especially as is. Like I said in that last table, about 350 to 1 billion birds die each year as a result of window strikes. And you'd think, well, haven't they learned by now? Can't birds learn this behavior to avoid windows? Unfortunately, they can't. They're unable to detect glass. To them, it just looks like open air, where to us, we can detect that glass. Many birds have their eyes positioned on the side of their heads, and so it's harder to see objects directly in front of them, and especially when they can't detect glass to begin with, they have no way of knowing what they're about to fly into. As previously mentioned, they migrate at night, and they can often get confused with artificial nighttime lighting, and confuse that with, say, stars or the moon. And also many species are more active at night as well. And our cities are directly in their flyways. Here in Denver and throughout all of Colorado, we're in the Central Flyway. There's 4 major flyways, or 4 flyways in the United States: the Atlantic, the Mississippi, here in the Central, and then on the Pacific Flyway. And we're directly in, like I said, the Central Flyway, where many big cities such as Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, Salt Lake City, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, they're all situated in that. And so our cities not only have eliminated large swaths of the historical habitat, we've imposed a grid of illuminated and shimmering obstacles for them. And studies have shown that the birds are increasing their use of stopover habitat in lieu of more suitable habitat, which makes sense since our cities continue to build and expand. But it's still alarming as this can significantly decrease their chances of migration success. And so this begs the question, are all buildings bad? Simple answer is no. Not all buildings are bad. I tend to think of it more as a gradient. Some are extremely destructive for birds, which I'll get into some of the examples in Denver. And some probably don't pose any threat at all. Think of those big, giant wood or brick buildings that have very few windows, buildings you don't really want to be in. Luckily, those don't induce a lot of birds to fly into. Unfortunately, though, like I said, many are, at least in some aspect, they are. Brightly lit buildings often attract birds, both at night and during the day. The Denver Convention Center, pictured down there in the bottom with the big friendly blue bear, provides such an example of a well-lit building. If you've been anywhere in downtown Denver or the tech center or areas with a lot of development in the metro area, which is pretty much the entire metro area, since we're all under development, you've probably noticed all of the buildings being built, residential and commercial. Many of these buildings are laden with glass, and it's not restricted to just residential or just commercial. All buildings are built with glass. Architects love glass. I get it. They're aesthetically pleasing. They win architects awards for the designs. It just looks nice. But as we know now, they're just a huge detriment to birds. If you look at the photo on the top, that's one of the Hilton hotels downtown. That's downtown Denver. If you were a bird, would you have a clue what was going on there? You can see the building next to it reflected off the glass. I'm sure when they're flying that they can see some greenery, but they perhaps see the sky. And if you can't detect that, you'd have no idea that there's a 100-floor building impeding your flight path. So if you were a bird, or imagine just that's one building on one block in one part of one city. Imagine multiple buildings on multiple blocks in multiple parts of the city, in multiple cities, and you can start kind of picturing just the scale of destruction that our cities can cause. No, I'm not railing against cities by any stretch of the imagination. I've only ever lived in large metropolitan areas, and I'm a city kid. But it's just worth pointing out just some of the effects that cities can have on our birds. Buildings that are close to bodies of water or swaths of greenery are also pretty detrimental to birds. They pose a threat. While Denver isn't near any large bodies of water like other cities are, the Platte River, the Bear Creek, and Cherry Creek, among other bodies of water that we do have, all provide great habitat for birds. I'm sure all of us have gone to some of our bodies of water and gone birding. And when development abuts these bodies of water, which will soon be happening in mass along the Platte River, more and more birds will be colliding with these buildings right off of the bodies of water, unless these buildings are designed with bird-friendly features and designs. Examples of some of these features will be discussed later in this presentation, so I'll get to it a little bit later. It's important to point out that studies have found that 90% of all bird strikes, bird window collisions, occur within the first 3 floors of a building. So while many people want to first focus on the high-rise apartments and the skyscrapers in Chicago or New York or Denver, it's really the first 30 feet that are detrimental to birds. And trying to find ways to focus on that will be huge to the success of Lights Out Denver and other similar programs in other cities across the country. So what you'll be looking at now is just a few newspaper clippings, a few headlines from online articles. So you already know that birds collide with glass. They collide with glass for a whole slew of reasons. And apartment complexes and houses are not immune to that. They'll also collide with them. But they often also collide with boats, especially cruise ships. And the cruise industry, which, as we all know, is going under huge transformation because of coronavirus, and before this all happened, they were trying to find ways to make cruise ships more bird friendly. Because if you've ever been on one, or even if you haven't, you probably know that they all have these big swaths of windows. Especially when that water is reflected off those windows, birds can be attracted to that or might not see that. So this photo that you're looking at right now is from 2 months ago. Hundreds of birds were found on just one deck of one ship over one night. And so imagine that on multiple ships, on multiple ports, on multiple cities, on multiple nights. And again, you can start piecing together just how large of an issue this is and how encompassing this issue is of bird collisions. Sports stadiums are culprits frequently as well. Here's another one from a New York City condo that happened to kill 28 birds just in one night, let alone multiple nights. But sports stadiums are culprits as well. US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, the home of my favorite football team, is among the worst, if not the worst, for collisions with birds. Its facades are predominantly all glass, as you can see in this picture. You can see the Minneapolis skyline reflected in the distance. And that's reflection, that you're not looking through, that is a reflection. And the stadium is just a few blocks from the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, so when the stadium design was first chosen in like 2012, 2013, birding organizations like the Twin Cities Audubon knew just how detrimental this was going to be. And they tried to work with the stadium authority to change some of the designs to make them a little bit more bird friendly. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And the stadium continues to kill birds by the dozens, if not hundreds, on a weekly basis, especially during the migrating season. On the other end of that spectrum is the Fiserv Forum in Milwaukee, which is the home of my favorite basketball team. So I'm kind of in a weird spot when it comes to stadiums here. It's lauded as the most bird-friendly stadium in all sports in all of North America. It was opened in late 2018, I want to say, early 2019, when the basketball season started. And it was designed, the architects and design firm worked extensively with Audubon and the American Bird Conservancy to implement some of these bird-friendly designs. And because of that, it's gotten a lot of praise and applaud from the birding community and from elsewhere as well. So now we'll be moving into the meat and potatoes of Lights Out Denver. I've introduced the background of anthropogenic bird mortality and why and how our cities and buildings pose a threat to birds. We're now going to be moving into how Lights Out Denver addresses that within our city. All right. Our roots started in 2014 when we were designated by the Fish and Wildlife Service as an urban bird treaty city. Another kind of a tongue twister. The birding community loves long words and tongue twisters like that. The Fish and Wildlife Service's Urban Bird Treaty Program is a conservation initiative between the Fish and Wildlife Service and participating cities like Denver. It brings together government agencies like Denver Parks and Recreation, nonprofit agencies, and academic institutions to create bird-friendly environments and to provide citizens, predominantly youth, with opportunities to connect to nature through birding and through conservation. There are 30 cities total. The first city was New Orleans in 1999, followed very shortly after by Chicago. And since 28 other cities have become signatories to this program, which is another source of pride for Denver, is that we're one of only 30 cities across the country to be a bird treaty city. We wish other several hundred or thousand cities across the country would participate as well. So we still have a long ways to go. It supports cities in conserving urban habitat for birds, reducing urban hazards for birds, hence reducing bird collisions, hence Lights Out Denver. Also, it supports cities in educating and engaging urban communities in bird appreciation, recreation, and conservation. The three prongs of a lot of conservation programs and regimes, especially the education and the conservation piece. When Denver was designated by this program, one of the city's goals was to implement a lights out type of program, type of project. Shortly after, in 2015, a Lights Out Denver-esque program was started by the city's Office of Sustainability. However, it didn't have much success getting off the ground for whatever reason that might be. So the idea for a Lights Out type of project was still very much in our heads, but no action was taken to restart one until 2018. And it was finally launched in 2019. So here's a list of all of the cities, all of the participating cities in this program. There's a website I was going to take you to that would scroll through that, but I think we can kind of get a general gist of everything going on just on this map. And as you can see, Denver is number 6 right there, right in the smack dab in the middle of that. And there aren't many other projects in our region. If you look at the Midwest or the East Coast, there's several of them. Texas has 3 alone. And so it's pretty cool. It's not cool, it's another reason for another point of emphasis for us to get Lights Out Denver started so that we can be a model for other regional cities. Say, for example, Omaha, Nebraska, or Salt Lake City, or Boise, Idaho. So this is our logo for now. Clearly, it's a work in progress, especially when you compare it to some of these other cities' logos. However, they've been around a lot longer. We've been so focused on just getting our project off the ground that our logo is kind of taking a back seat. But we know that is a key part of moving this project forward, is getting both a new logo and a social media presence and its own website as well. Projects aimed at reducing urban bird collisions first started in the 1990s in Canada, in Toronto. Since then, dozens of cities have adopted similar programs. I've mentioned that a few times now. Each of these programs consists of data collection on bird collisions. They'll have a team of volunteers patrolling a certain sector of typically the downtown area early in the morning or in the afternoon, looking for birds that have collided with buildings. That is essential to every one of these style of projects. And the data can help them understand certain trends, such as just total number of collisions going on the route, the vulnerability of each individual species. Is a cardinal more vulnerable than a robin? Is that more vulnerable than waterfowl, and so on and so forth? They can determine collisions by the building, which is another key aspect of it. You want to know not just the species and volume, but what buildings are most prone for collisions. And they can also determine and provide long-term data into when migrations start and end each year. And as some of us may know, that's changing slightly in certain areas. Further, each one of these programs tries to work with businesses and building owners, as well as other local stakeholders, to reduce collisions on building by building basis, which is where that data comes in handy. Typically, this is achieved by working with these building owners to reduce their nighttime lighting. So turning off non-essential lighting of, say, the cash register building in downtown Denver to aid in bird conservation. But this goal has also been achieved with window retrofits or the reduction of indoor greenery or water features of these large buildings. Lights Out Denver is based on these other projects. We're no different in that regard of these other projects. We have the same goal, and that is reducing bird collisions in our city. We've consulted extensively with administration from other projects, most notably the Fatal Light Awareness Program in Canada. Lights Out Baltimore has been a huge help in establishing our project, as well as the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. They're located in several cities. Since we have even lent support and advice to fledgling programs in other cities. So we not only benefited from these other established organizations, we've now got to the point where we can lend some of our advice and expertise to new projects being formed. These projects all collaborate with each other, borrow ideas from each other, share data with each other, share goals, share a few peers and photos with each other. We act as a network across the country. Even though each one operates in its own city or region, we kind of operate as a network in that regard. We've separated Lights Out Denver into 3 phases. We are currently in phase 1. And in phase 1, we are collecting data through volunteer monitoring. Or this past spring season, because of COVID, it's been Vicky and myself, the city's wildlife expert. We've been doing the monitoring, or in the fall, we've had a team of volunteers doing the monitoring, looking for these victims of collisions. We then analyze that data, and then we also are rescuing whatever birds we can. If there is a bird that's been a victim of a collision but is still alive, we then have a procedure to rescue that bird. Again, I'll get to that here in a little bit. We have 2 routes that is walked by our team of volunteers. So in the core downtown area, we have 2 routes, and the routes are between Broadway to the east and Arapahoe to the west, northwest. And then the first route is between 14th and 16th Streets. And then the second route is between 17th and 19th Streets. And again, this is downtown. Vicki and I identified these as areas of downtown with high densities of candidate buildings, meaning that there's a lot of glass, predominantly on the first 3 floors. They're close by each other. They might have courtyards with a lot of greenery and shrubbery, or they just might be tall glass buildings. We acknowledge that there are other areas with high densities of glass buildings. For example, if you've been to the Union Station area lately, that's one just big giant piece of glass, the whole Union Station area. We would love to extend our project into some of these, expand our range of monitoring, but in the first year of this program, we've remained focused on getting it off the ground and recruiting and maintaining volunteers and gathering data. And like I said, any deceased birds, depending on the state of the specimen, are taken to the Denver Museum of Nature and Sciences Ornithology Collection. So phase 2 is hopefully at the phase that we'll be entering here in the next little while. This is where we go out to the community, to the downtown business and building community, to work with them to abide by some of our guidelines. Turning off their non-essential nighttime lighting, especially during the migration season. Ideally, they would do that all year round, but it's especially important in the migration period. We'll still be monitoring throughout the entire length of this project, whether that's 10 years or 1,000 years. We're still going to be monitoring and collecting that data because data is key. We need that data to analyze all these different trends. But this is where we really want to start getting our more than just a foot in the door with these buildings. We want to start making our impact in phase 2. And again, that's largely by having business and building owners turn off their essential lighting at night. And then phase 3, which is our ultimate goal, is to work with city legislators to pass bird-friendly ordinances or bird-friendly legislation that requires buildings to be constructed of bird-friendly materials. And we're in a unique position compared to other Lights Out projects, is that we are in the city. We are a city or local government agency. So that provides us access to some of these city planners and city legislators that other projects don't necessarily have or have had off the bat. And again, we'll still be monitoring throughout this. So here's a quick list of our administration, our partners, and our collaborators. Like I said, we are housed within Denver Parks and Recreation, but we partner with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, especially when that's where we take our deceased specimen. Denver Audubon, Community College of Denver has been a huge help, especially with recruiting volunteers and getting some of our youth interested in this topic. They've been wonderful. Greenwood Wildlife Rehab Center, which is where we take our injured birds or any injured birds that we come across. That's where they'll be getting medical attention. I always say that our project presents a catch-22 of sorts. if our project is to be successful, which is our goal, obviously, meaning if we are to achieve bird conservation and advance bird conservation throughout Denver, we need data on a lot of birds. And to get data on a lot of birds, we need a lot of essentially dead birds. We need that if we're going to push legislation through the city's government. Obviously, that'd be great, but that means there's a lot of birds that have died with colliding with buildings. So on the other hand, we don't want to find a lot of birds because that means our cities are already relatively bird friendly, and birds aren't necessarily colliding with our buildings. So we're kind of in this very weird space where we want a lot of birds, but we don't want a lot of birds. We want our city to be bird friendly, but perhaps it already is bird friendly. So it's kind of a weird space right now. We're still trying to navigate through. But we are doing just that. We are navigating through. We are always looking for new collaborators, new partners, new volunteers. We've been exploring ways to get the zoo involved in the project and for us to have a hand in some of their bird-friendly procedures. So the zoo is another organization that we've collaborated with and we are hoping to continue to collaborate with. Now we're going to move into the data that we've collected so far. So this is a list of the species that we've positively ID'd in our first 2 seasons of field collection, of data collection. There are 18 species listed here. Some are, you have your kind of your common ones, your rock pigeons, your rock doves, so to speak. We've had a crow, we've had house sparrows, we've had starlings. We've also had less common species. These species that we don't typically see on a daily basis, your average person doesn't see. Your Townsend's warbler, your rock wrens, your clay-colored sparrows, your hummingbirds. So that was an experience, or that's something that is being brought to light with this project, is just the number of species that are colliding with buildings. So far we've collected 39 different specimens across our first 2 seasons. Again, 18 species have been identified. There have been 5 unknown species, whether through just the desiccation of the specimen that we found, or through just our team of volunteers or administration couldn't positively ID it. 32 of our 39 specimen were deceased upon sight. 7 were alive and were transported to Greenwood Wildlife Rehab Center, which is pretty cool. 7 is a small number, but it's 7 more birds that were alive that otherwise might not have been. In the fall, our first season, we had over 30 volunteers participate in the program. That number was expected to grow and was growing for the spring season, but we all know what happened with that, and we weren't allowed to have a team of volunteers on the field with us. There are other ways volunteers can get involved besides just monitoring, looking for dead birds, especially because that can be kind of traumatizing to some people, to a lot of people, is coming across these dead birds. Other ways they can get involved are spreading the word about our project. We just like DFO, we always love spreading the word about a project and the work that we do. They can help analyze some of our data, help identify birds that we are unable to, which again is often given the state of the deceased specimen. So there are 2 buildings that I want to highlight so far, or highlight in this presentation briefly. These are 2 most problematic buildings, the buildings where we found the most collisions. This one is by far the leader in collisions. This is the address is 717 17th Street. A lot of 7s in there. It's on 17th Street between Stout and California downtown. I think it's had 9 of our 39 specimen total so far. And you'd understand once you see pictures of it. So this is kind of a more aerial view of it. Down below, you see the courtyard. It's hard to see from this picture, but that courtyard has a lot of plants in it, has trees and has flowers. And those trees and flowers are very close to the windows. It also has 2 buildings that have a lot of glass surrounding the courtyard. And this is a more street level view, and you can see, you get a better view of the courtyard in that glass. And on the photo on the left, you see that oval. That is where we have found those birds. That is a part of the courtyard in which we have found those birds. So beautiful courtyard, beautiful buildings. It's a great place for people to rest, hang out. There's a coffee shop right there. Not so great for birds. Second building is on the corner of 19th and Broadway. It's again, it's a really pretty building, has a nice, lovely courtyard. It's situated, the courtyard is situated between the church and the building. Again, nice place to eat, have a cup of coffee, but it's not friendly to birds. We found, I think, 5 or 6 of our specimen at this location. And I want to emphasize too that we're not trying to work against these buildings. We're not trying to demonize these buildings by pointing them out or by trying to find data on the collisions that take place there. We want that data on these buildings so we can work with these buildings to enact certain bird-friendly guidelines to prevent bird collisions. Because at the end of the day, buildings and building owners and business owners don't want to kill birds. I don't think anybody inherently wants to kill birds. So that's why it's important to work with them and not against them. So some of our next steps that we've outlined. So we're still in phase 1 of our project. We're about a year in, two migration seasons in. And so we love to recruit more volunteers, which is something that we're working on. It just COVID is throwing a wrench in that, just like it has with everything. Getting situated for fall migration, which really is not that far away. We'll be out early or late August. We'd love to expand our area of monitoring, like I mentioned. We'd love to look at more buildings east of Broadway, like on the Lincoln Corridor, or close to the Platte River, the Denver Tech Center, the Union Station area. We'd love to incorporate some of that as well. Find ways to increase opportunities for collaboration with organizations, as well with building owner, building management organizations. So that kind of concludes the aspect about Lights Out Denver. And I'm going to ask the rest of the committee here if we feel there's enough time for me to cover the next 2 parts of this presentation. If not, we can go directly into the Q&A. So Steve, it looks like Steve unmuted himself.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for
Okay.
maybe Dave to, who's ever the timekeeper. I mean, from Susan. Susan looks like she's ready to go. So if you want to continue,
Okay.
I think you can. I've
Cool.
got a few questions for you too. So keep that.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'll go through this. And if any time you feel I'm long-winded, then poke a hole in those sales, and we'll just go straight to the Q&A. No problem.
Sounds good.
Perfect. So this is an aspect of kind of bird proofing our yards, or making our yards or home or office or building more bird friendly. Bird community is already pretty apt with this and in tune with this. But there are ways that we, like I said, birds still do collide with our kitchen windows or our bathroom windows. So there are still things that we can do to increase the bird friendliness of our dwelling, so to speak. Paint-based markings or drawings on windows, as you can see in the top left there. Those can be used in any type of building and any type of window. You do have to reapply those quite often. Adhesive tapes, which you can see in the bottom photo right there. Adhesive tapes, they can be used to create patterns, straight lines, vertical, horizontal lines that birds can detect, and birds will, it can prevent collisions. It's important to note, though, that any sort of fritting or horizontal or vertical lines you make have to abide by the 2-inch by 4-inch rule, which means that they cannot be spaced more than 2 inches apart horizontally and 4 inches apart vertically. Otherwise, birds can still fit through that. Think of your hummingbirds and some of your other smaller birds. External film coverings, such as these silhouettes that you can see here, can be used to deter birds. Below that, on that same photo, you have fritting, which is a sort of treatment that you can put on your windows. that still allows internal visitors to look out, but it also allows birds to detect it, which can help deter bird collisions, so to speak. Another thing you can do is hanging filamentous material, such as rope or string, over glass surfaces. This has also been used on wires and cables to prevent birds from perching or nesting on there. On a more commercial scale, like I mentioned, fritting of windows, it's an expensive process, which is why it's a more commercial scale. Is often implemented. That's often a retrofit that buildings choose to use. For example, the two photos on the bottom are of the Javits Convention Center in New York City. The photo on the left is just an external view. As you can see, a lot of glass, and you'd think, oh my God, like that, a lot of birds are going to crash and burn there. But then you get up close and you see these dotted pattern. That's called fritting. Birds detect that, and it deters collisions. So that's something that people can do with windows. Other things that you can do with your landscape and vegetation. You can move vegetation or water features in your yard within 3 feet of your window. Again, that deters collisions. Might not deter collisions as much, but it can deter fatalities, because within 3 feet, a bird's not going to get the velocity on its flight that it would require bodily harm. So that's one recommendation that organizations such as American Bird Conservancy recommend. Commercial buildings should avoid having vegetation features such as this one, or glass-laden courtyards within sight of the windows, because again, birds see that as lovely habitat to perch or to feed on, and they can fly right into that window. Another thing that we can do to kind of bird-friendly up our dwellings or our buildings is lighting regimes. People can reduce or eliminate artificial nighttime lighting, and that includes, especially during the migration periods, turning off porch lights, moonlighting, or indoor lights at night can reduce collisions. Making sure that any light features you have or your building has doesn't shoot up, as evidenced in the 9/11 memorial. It only shoots down. Phase 2 of Lights Out Denver plans on working with downtown area business and building owners to address their windows and lighting regimes. One thing that Chicago, for example, has been really successful at has been getting their entire skyline, or vast majority of their skyline, to turn off the lights. So this photo is of Manhattan. This was actually caused by a power outage, so not based off bird-friendly advocates, but that is something that we envision with Lights Out Denver, or Dark Sky Chicago, or Lights Out Baltimore. This image on top is something that we hope to accomplish one day, either on a daily basis, 365 days a year, or at least during the migration periods. Everything's kind of slow. And then real quick, I'll touch upon current bird-friendly legislation, because again, that is our ultimate outcome, is to pass bird-friendly legislation in Denver. On the local scale, New York City just passed a bill or a law that requires all new development or retrofits to be bird-friendly. And that's amazing, because New York is our biggest city in the country, is this country's biggest city. If New York can do it, there's hope that Denver can do it, that Salt Lake City can do it, that your rural town that has 2 stoplights can do it. This is something I'm especially proud of. This is my alma mater. Even universities are getting involved. So for example, the University of Minnesota passed a student resolution that makes all new development mandates that they design with bird-friendly materials, which is phenomenal. Again, another reason why I'm proud to be a Gopher. There's state legislation. Maryland just passed a law that, again, requires all state buildings to be bird-friendly. There's also federal legislation, too, on a various scale. So you have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which is extremely binding and has been largely successful. A few holes have been poked in its sails by the current administration, but that it's still been largely successful. Endangered Species Act has been largely the same. One thing I do want to point out, there's a small paragraph within the Department of the Interior's budget for this year. That mandates that all department agencies, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, and National Park Service, mandates that they establish a monitoring regime of all of their buildings, and to enact certain bird-friendly designs of those buildings. So it's a small thing, a small feat, but still a feat nonetheless, and a step forward in this direction. So that concludes the presentation. I just want to conclude real quick by saying we're working towards making our cities, our campuses, our states, our public lands more bird friendly. And at times it seems like a daunting task. And it requires action and diligence from people within and without the birding community. But I think that we can do it. And we're gaining momentum right now, as you can see in some of the current legislation. And that's a bit of positive that we could all take with us, especially with all the negative things that have been going on lately. So thank you for listening. Thanks for putting up with me for the last 51 minutes. So I appreciate it from everybody. And so now I think we're going to turn it over to some Q&A.
Great, thanks a lot, Alex. Everybody, you can probably hear their applause. They're probably very faint, but they're out there because they have to travel ways. Hey, we've got a number of really good questions here, and I'll try and I can group some of them together a bit because they are, we do have some overlap, which is really good, but we'll start right in. We've got actually in the form of multiple question, but so the question is, describe the responsibilities of a typical volunteer monitor. What's their day like? And then a follow-up is, how does one sign up to become a volunteer?
Well, perfect. That is a question that I'm glad I received, because then I don't need to go into the day-to-day responsibilities and all that. So thank you for asking that. To answer the second question first, here is the contact information for myself, as well as for Vicky Vargas Madrid, the other administrator for Lights Out Denver. The way to get involved, shoot us an email and title the email with something to do with Lights Out Denver, and just say you're looking to volunteer, and then we can discuss next steps. The next steps with volunteering are a little tricky right now with COVID going on, and we're still unsure if we can have volunteers out in the field. But shoot us an email nonetheless, and we'll add you to a volunteer list that we've already compiled. And we do send out, not monthly, but about quarterly emails to our volunteers, just letting them know what's going on, keeping them abreast. So long answer short, email, you can email us. Your first question, which asks what a typical volunteer does. So during the migration season, a couple times a week, we have a calendar where volunteers can sign up 7 days a week or 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And they go out at 5:30 in the morning with a fellow volunteer on that route. And all they do is walk that route. One takes the north side of the street, one takes the south side of the street, and they just go up and down 14th, 15th, 16th Street, or the other route, and looking for birds. And upon finding a bird, there's a data sheet that we have that you'll fill out. Simple things: species, condition of the bird, location, and building address. And then you'll either leave the bird where it is if it's a little too desiccated, or you'll bag the bird and transport it to the museum or the rehab center. So that's your typical volunteer responsibility. Each route takes about an hour and a half, 2 hours to monitor. So you're typically done 7:30ish, give or take a little bit, depending on how many birds you find. So early mornings, but birders are used to early mornings. So that should be nothing new. So yeah, it's relatively straightforward. And we do have volunteer training sessions. Again, I don't know if those are going to happen. But we do have a PowerPoint that walks volunteers through exactly what they'll do. But about 2 hours a day, however many days each week or each month or each season you want to volunteer. And you'll just be looking for these birds and taking simple data and or collecting the birds.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Absolutely.
Another question it gets to maybe some policy or design kind of issues is if the first 33 feet of buildings are critical, the obvious question is why not have buildings go dark for the first 4 floors? Is that something that you've ever talked with building owners about?
That's something that we definitely plan on doing. That's part of phase 2 that we're looking to do, and that is exactly that's the quintessential goal of phase 2 of this project. And the kind of one of the 2 overarching goals of this project is to buildings turn off the lights at night, and we pass legislation that makes buildings more bird friendly. So this part is definitely something we want to do. Being in phase 1, we've been so focused on getting this project started that we kind of not pushed that, but we had planned for that after a year or 2 to start doing. So that is something that we are looking to do the next season or next migration season or 2.
Okay. Got a combined question here too, and I think you've touched on these, so probably familiar topic. But do you monitor all year long or only during migration? And second of all, what does your data show so far in Denver?
We have for the first 10 months or so of this project, we focus primarily just during the migration season. We do try to start a little bit before the migration season. But yeah, we focus on that, again, with limited resources, with volunteer hours, and then staff resources as well. We've been a little limited with the longevity of our seasons. And also we've received, with some of the other lights out projects, like in Baltimore or Chicago, we asked them that same question, and they said, by far the vast majority of the birds you'll find are during the migration season. So that is definitely something that we can expand upon going forward, as long as we maintain the strong base that we're on right now. And then the second part of that, about what the trends have shown for Denver, actually I have my data. I can pull up. Vicky, stop me if you think this is a breach of protocol, but I can pull up the data right now. I have the data sheet open. So I can do that. Overall, it hasn't shown much in terms of like big trends. The biggest things that we have, actually, no, I'm just gonna go back to my PowerPoint. I'm just gonna do that because the data is kind of a mess right now. We've just kind of noticed what buildings tend to have the most collisions. And again, that's been those 2 buildings that I've outlined so far. And then by species, we've gotten, as you might imagine, quite a few starlings, quite a few house sparrows, not as many doves, like rock doves, as I'd expect. And for whatever reason, like there's thousands of them downtown, but I think we've only found like 1 or 2 of those. So we've, so far, just as species, we kind of have a smorgasbord of different species, and nothing and the data doesn't necessarily show yet what species are most vulnerable. If that answered that question.
Okay. Yeah, here's a little question with a little more historical basis here. This effort started and got this far 6 to 10 years ago until it was disbanded within its first year. Why was the prior project disbanded, and what are you doing differently to make it successful this time? Good luck and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for the luck. So yeah, the previous one in 2014, 2015. My guess, I wasn't part of the team then. I wasn't with Denver Parks and Rec then. But what I've been told through discussions with administration and my boss is that it was housed within the Office of Sustainability. We are not in the Office of Sustainability. We are in the Natural Resource Operations Department. So the Office of Sustainability kind of is focused more on other tasks that don't necessarily orient to birds, relate to birds. Often they do go hand in hand, like with legislation that has been passed. Any sort of bird-friendly legislation passed at the local state level corresponds to energy efficient buildings too. But with what happened 4 or 5 years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, is I think that department has had too many other tasks that they were focused on doing, that they were tasked with. And so the project never took off. I think that initial rush of being deemed a urban bird treaty city kind of spurred them to action, but that soon faded away. There's money associated with being designated an urban bird treaty city, and that money was spent as well. So a lot of factors kind of went against initiating the Lights Out Denver program. What we're doing differently this time is that we have staff designated solely to it, which is me. So that's been the biggest aspect. We've been able to afford, in our department, we've been able to afford having just one person focus 90% of the tasks on that. So getting with stakeholders, establishing a volunteer base, establishing protocols, sending out emails, doing presentations like this. So things that we've been afforded to do that perhaps the Office of Sustainability just didn't have the staff resources for.
Okay. Have just a couple of questions left. Let's see. Oh, here's one. Do you work, or is there a plan to work proactively with developers? So before they start building?
Hopefully that's what the legislation does. The legislation, if we're successful in that, that'll require that will require developers to use bird-friendly materials in their designs or in their construction. So obviously we know that's several years down the road, or potentially several years down the road. So yeah, we definitely could be proactive in that. And there's definitely things that we can do. We're just so focused on, like I said, establishing our base and kind of staying afloat and establishing a project. So that is definitely something that we can do. It's just harder to do when you don't have a piece of legislation requiring them to do it. Because often it is a little bit more expensive, and it does require a little bit more planning than just going about their construction as planned or as normal. So that does kind of impede on that as well.
Okay, thank you. We got another question or two added, but if we have time, we'll go right ahead. We have one question just about lights. Are blinking lights or moving lights worse or better for bird safety?
That's a good question. That's actually something I've never come across on in any of my research or any of my work. I'm just going off of a hunch here. I'm going to say they're bad, but probably not as bad as statutory lights that are fixed in place. Mm-hmm. Perhaps birds can tell that the searchlights or blinking lights or strobe lights are moving, and therefore not a star, not the sun, not whatever cue that they normally navigate with. That's just my guess. I can't back that up, but yeah, that's a good question. That's something I haven't really thought about.
Okay, thank you. We have two more. Where can we read your project plan and timetable methodology? Just kind of, is there a document of kind of like your research plan or project plan or something like that?
We do have a presentation that we've compiled that does list that. We also have two separate volunteer protocols that outline that. So I do have them in document form, in PDF form. So if that person is interested, or if the whole group is interested in that, we can send a follow-up email. Someone from this panel can either send a follow-up email, or the person who asked that question could please feel free to reach out to me on this email, and I can email that to you.
Okay, great. Let's see. Looks like we got one more. Just got another one here. So, one thing that is of course on everyone's mind these days is the whole pandemic. And one question is, will decreasing tax revenues due to COVID put the program at risk?
It shouldn't. Outside of, say, staff salaries, which aren't necessarily affected. There aren't any expenditures that we use for this. So it shouldn't, largely because, again, this is run by, we rely on volunteers to help run this. So outside of myself and Vicky, there aren't any other staff, like financial resources associated with it. And even so, that shouldn't get in the way of any sort of longevity of this project. And we've had discussions about that, about how COVID could affect the project. But none of the scenarios do we think that it's going to have any sort of impact outside of if volunteers are allowed to monitor. Because if they don't, like I said, this past spring, Vicky and I, as well as a dedicated volunteer from Audubon, they monitored. We all monitored. And that'll be the same for the fall, if that's required. And same thing for the spring if COVID rears its ugly head again in the spring. We're ready for staff to do the monitoring.
All righty. Okay, and then our last question is kind of just a one that we are probably all interested in is when you're trying to make our windows bird safe, do blinds work or not?
That's one thing I meant to mention in my presentation. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. I've kind of come across it as a mixed bag. Yes, they do work better than just leaving your windows wide open, but it's not the be all end all best case scenario. Like for example, the American Bird Conservancy, which puts out a lot of these guidelines for making buildings in your yard bird friendly. They say that you can do that, especially if you have greenery very close to your windows that would otherwise reflect off of the window. But that's something that I think that can be easily experimented with by the individual. So if you just go in your yard on a sunny day or on a day where you see the reflection, go outside, look at it, and then go back inside, close the curtain, close the drapes, and see if that has solved that reflection. So I live in an apartment, so I can't do that. But yeah, yes, it does work, but by no means is it the best solution.
Okay. Great. Well, I think those are the questions we have that unless I've deleted or added or so, while I'm going through both columns here, but I think we've reached them all. So Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And with that, our time is up. A great presentation, Alex. It was a real pleasure to have you tonight. We want to thank you all for attending tonight's webinar. And it's great to have so many of you interested and asking questions. Thanks very much for your interest. And I hope you'll join us again at a webinar in the future. And good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.